Hey Vipers, cheers. Welcome back to another week of VIP. Today we're going to talk about snare drum, and we're going to do the kind of the same process as last week for kick drum, but obviously snare is very different sounding from kick, and there's some things you want to keep in mind, some different tricks we're going to do to really bring that out in the mix that we have here. And yes, I'm rocking the black coffee today. Boom. So I don't want this video hopefully to go on for 20 minutes. So this week we're going to deal with snare, and we got the top and bottom snare to contend with. And then next week we're going to deal with toms, and then do a final week where I want to bring it all together. And I got some fun surprises for you for that week. So stay tuned. But for now, let's get rid of my face. Boom. Oh, real quickly, let me show you something. Check it out. As of today, I'm shooting this in early May. Just got the CD. Actually, I just got the masters from Ian Shepherd, the master audio files. The album is completely finished, and here's the artwork that my buddy David is doing. So you'll see our very own Justin DeFebo here, B3 master, played on 3 of the songs. He's a VIP member, which is awesome, and yeah, so it's gonna be fun. Stay tuned for more on that. Okay, so let's go back to the drums. Let's just take a quick listen to where we are at this point. When I pulled this session up to shoot this video, I was listening, and I had the kick drum fairly loud last week. That's something I'll raise my hand and say that I'm not the best at setting vocal level and kick drum level. I have a hard time with, especially if I'm on speakers with kick drum. It just sounds nice to just keep pushing that fader up, 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 because you just, you know, it's kind of like if you run sound at a live concert, or maybe you attended a concert recently, it's almost, the kick drum almost can't be too loud. It's punchy, and it's always way louder than you're going to hear it in a recording. So if you think you like the kick drum level, try backing it off just a little bit. So I'm going to blend it back in just to make sure I have a good level to start with to balance the snare off of. So I'm going to turn it down and blend it in to a decent level. I think that's where I had it last week. I think that's just too loud. Okay, right in there feels good. Okay, so today I'm going to do the same thing we did last week with the snares. We're going to take these two, and we're going to bust those to their own snares channel. Oops, you know what? I lied. That's not how I did it last week. We're going to leave these coming to the drums bus. Forgot what I did. We're going to create an aux. Funny, one week difference. I can forget everything I did last week. Call this snares, and we're going to send both of these to the snare bus. Let me zoom in here. Got a snare bus. We're going to do a pre-fade send. We'll just send a full signal, and then just copy that bad boy over. So now we got this. Woo! My apologies. Let's try this. Pretty good sounding track right out of the gate. Let's real quickly check the phase on these. Phase is obviously, you hear me and Graham talk about this a lot, especially if you're a Dueling Mixes member. We're always checking phase on stuff. So I'm going to put this mix tool on here on this one snare, and I'm going to invert the phase, and we're just going to check that real quickly. So okay, when I inverted the phase, the snare got a lot thinner, so that's how I know they are in phase. Top and bottom snares, if you've never recorded drums before, there's no reason you would know this, but top and bottom snare are completely out of polarity with each other. One signal goes up, one goes down. So when recording, you'll see this one starts up, this one also starts up, which means Tim, when he was recording this, actually flip the polarity of one of these so that they're in polarity with each other. Now there's a bit of a delay here. You could go and adjust that, but I'm not I'm not freaking out about the tone. The tone sounds pretty good. I'm happy with it. So I'm just going to start right from the top with what we got there. Okay, so here's our snare sound. And let's just play around with the blend first. So obviously we have the top snare, which sounds like this. It's got a lot of that ring, a lot of the body of the snare drum itself. And then we've got the bottom snare, which is going to be obviously pick up a lot of the snares down there and be pretty higher frequency and aggressive. So it's going to capture, the way I'm hearing it, is a lot of the beef and the body of the snare sound is going to come from the top mic and the snap of it, but a lot of the crack and also the little subtle ghost note stuff is going to come from the bottom. So I see them both being pretty useful. So let's just adjust the levels here and get something we like. So we'll start with the main sound, the snare, the top snare, and then I'll blend in the bottom until we have a good sound going. Okay, that feels pretty good. Too much of the snare sound, and it's a little too, too much of that kind of white noise sort of sound to it. So we don't want to add too much in there. Okay, so now what are we going to do? Well, we can either EQ or compress. I love compressing a snare drum, and this is one of the few scenarios where I'll actually compress first on a snare. If I'm happy with the sound, I know I'm going to probably bring the ring out of that snare, but other than that, I like to see what happens when I compress a snare, because when you compress the snare drum, a lot of things happen to the tone, and you may realize that what EQ moves you were going to make before you might not need to because of the way the sound has changed because of compression. So I've got compression on my bus. Again, we're very bus heavy in this mix. We're doing a lot of things on the buses. My default settings here that I've set in Studio One are 50 milliseconds for tack and release. So we're going to do just like we did before. We're going to dial back till we have a nice amount of compression. We're going to balance the input and the output so the levels are the same, and then we're going to mess with the attack and see what we can do here. So first off, I'll do a more aggressive 3-to-1, and then just start dialing back till I get a decent tone or a decent amount of compression. It's pretty cool, the difference just of doing that. You got the attack. The attack is it's a pretty slow attack when it comes to snare drums. And so the difference you're hearing is the punch of that snare, the part that kind of cuts through and is a little too loud, is being tamed. So when the compressor's on, that snare's not quite punching through as much, and it's kind of a little tighter sounding. If you can imagine choking the snare like if you were choking somebody. If you ever use a lot of compression on a vocal, it sounds like the vocal's being choked or squeezed. It's that same sort of feel on the snare drum that you can hear. I'm going to play it again, and I'll start with it off and then turn it on, and you'll see what it sounds like. It just sounds like it meshed the top and bottom snare together even better. It just squished them together a little bit. Now you'll see we're doing about 6-7 dB of gain reduction. As we lower the attack, we're going to get more compression. That's one of the things that happens because we're compressing more of the signal. So that's okay. But let's go ahead and do that. Let's bring the attack down, and let's hear what it does to the tone. So suddenly all the punchiness goes away. We're at a really short 1 millisecond attack, and now instead of that snare punching, it's just kind of going whoosh, whoosh. There's not you hear it, and it's still percussive, but it doesn't punch through quite as much. Now, this is just a valuable thing to know. If your snare is really punching through, you hear a lot of people say, don't take away my transients. The transients are so important. And that's true, but with a snare drum, the transients on that are so short that you can have a good tone, but it's just punching through the mix way too much. So by using a faster attack, it's kind of acting like a limiter, and those transients just aren't quite getting through as much as they were before. And so it softens up the snare. It kind of makes it sound a little thicker, a little more white noise sounding, which is a lot of times what a rock snare is going to sound like. So let's dial it back. Now that we have a fast attack, let's dial it back and find a happy medium. I kind of like it right there. As I went up to 50 milliseconds and higher, it was kind of like, if you rewind the video, listen to that again, I won't do it again, you'll hear, it's almost like there's that headache sound. I don't like standing in a room when a snare drum is playing. I don't like it. My ears tense up and it hurts and all that stuff. So it feels like as I'm opening up the attack and making it a slower attack, so getting up there around 50, 60, 70 milliseconds, that it sounds more like a snare drum in a room. It's a little bit louder, and that lower mid punchiness that gives me a headache when I listen to drums comes through. So by dialing that attack back to something around, right now for this snare drum, 22.7 milliseconds ended up giving it a nice, I can hear that it doesn't sound any quieter, but it's not quite as punchy and headache sounding to me. And so that's where I'm going to set this. Now the release is just like last week with the kick drum. The release is going to be kind of like our tone knob. As we adjust this, it's going to adjust how much ring we're hearing. So you heard, as we were listening to the attack, I wanted you to listen to the beginning of the snare hit. Now we're focusing on the end of the snare hit, that wow, wow sound. Now we can EQ some of that ring out, but let's see what we can do with the release first, and then we can focus on the EQ after that. So we'll leave it where it is at around 50, and then I'll dial it back to really fast, and then just listen to the difference in tone as I roll it back up. It's really interesting. It's not as obvious as last week, but what I'm hearing, and you can go back and listen a couple times if you need to just rewind that and listen a couple times. But at the really fast attack, it just sounds more natural. The snare's getting hit, but the compressor's letting go so fast that there's not a lot. It's just really the first part of the snare hit is being compressed, and everything else sounds the same. It sounds very natural. And as I do the release up to 40 and 50, I don't hear a lot of difference. There's a little more ring. Not more ring, it just seems to sound different. And then when I get up into the 100 milliseconds and higher, which I usually don't go that high, I kind of like the way it sounds. It softens everything up, and so you hear the initial snare, and that ring is kind of slowly being brought back in, as opposed to being there right after the hit. So a slower release, that ring's there a little bit more. It's not as obvious as the kick drum, the big whoomph that we heard last week, but it's still there. And as we get up in the release, we're losing at 100 milliseconds, that ring is being tamed. So the compressor, for the first 100 milliseconds of each snare hit, the compressor is still holding on and slowly letting it go, rather than letting it come right through and being affected by our makeup gain here. So it actually, I like the tighter sound, and we might not have to we might not have to EQ that ring out now because of it. So listen to this again. I'm going to go back and just real quickly turn it back up. Fast release and then slow release. I just like that. That's kind of cool. So I'm going to leave it there around 95 milliseconds. What I was hearing, it's almost like I'm hearing less harmonics of that ring with the slower release, because it's keeping it turned down for a little bit longer, so those aren't having a chance to ring through quite as much. So that's kind of cool. I kind of like that. So let's go with EQ now, and I'll choose my stock EQ, and let's just see if there's anything else we want to change. We might not want to change anything, but let's take a look. So I just copied that EQ from the kick drum and set it to default. So let's see what we can do with this. Okay, I kind of like what we got there. I basically just rolled off the low end just in case there's a little more snare drum or kick drum low end that's bleeding in there, just to be safe. I think there might be a little bit there. You can see it bouncing a little bit in the meter. And then I just found that ring frequency and did a nice wide cut there. That's where a lot of the boxy sound of any drum can come from. Again, it's right at 500 hertz. And took it down by about 4.5 dB. And so that the ring that was there, we just de-emphasized it a little bit, and that lets the punchiness down here at 200 and 150 hertz come through, and the top end come through a little bit better too. So let's go, here's without EQ, and then I'll turn the EQ back on. Okay, I like that. Probably a little bit too much EQ. I'm going to bring that back. Maybe 3 dB. I felt like it took too much tone away. I like the ring, just not too much. Now without. Okay, so the ring's there. It's just tamed down ever so slightly. So let's take a listen. Here's what it sounds like. I'll bring up both plugins and let's listen to those separately, or let you see them on the screen, and I'll turn off all processing on these snares and then turn it back on. So here's nothing. Majority of the sound change you're hearing is from the compressor, and you'll notice it goes from sounding like a snare drum like you would hear it in a room when you're sitting there next to the snare drum, and it goes to sounding more like it sounds like in your mixes, like the snare drum sound you want. And a big part of that is compression. You get rid of some of that mid-range, you tighten everything up, it's not quite as punchy, and the transients don't cut through quite as much, and that's how you get that cool snare sound. So how much time we got left? Dang it, 18 minutes. I try not to make this go as long. So let's bring it back in the mix. I'm actually happy with that snare sound. I may add some delay or not delay, maybe some reverb to that. But we've got reverb on our drum bus, so I'm sure as we add this back into our full drum mix, probably gonna not need to add any more on the snare. So, and I thought about adding saturation here, but we've got it on our drum bus too, so I don't think we'll need it either. Now, sorry. I apologize. This snare is not going through our drum bus, so it might not matter. I may need to add some. Actually, you know what? I will. I'll add a little bit of reverb to this, real quick. Just a little bit. Okay, so now let's listen to it with the rest of the drums. So I'll start the drums, and I'll just bring the snare in. You'll see the fader move up as I'm moving the fader on my fader port here. And let's listen to how the snare drum changes. We've got a lot of snare in the overheads. Let's see how it changes once we bring this direct snare in. And again, this is not going through the bus. This is coming out the main outputs so that it's not being processed by the extra bus processing. Okay, here we go. Man, did you hear how that snare just suddenly jumped out and said, hey? It was right when I got around over this -12, right in there, just suddenly the snare just came in and said, hey, I'm here. How do I sound? Sounds really good. Let's do that one more time. That was actually really cool. Listen to the change and how much more present the snare comes. It's not bringing much more volume to the snare. It's just suddenly the snare moves from the back of the room to the front of the room, and in a good, wonderful way. Now, if we take the snare away, listen to how much it loses. Now, what's fun here, and we'll talk about this in 2 weeks when we kind of put it all together and kind of get the final drum sound and blend it back in with our tracks, is at this point, if we're hearing the kick and snare at a good level and there's too much overhead, too much cymbals, too much of the overall drum sound, we can adjust this guy up and down to taste, because this is kind of our overall drum sound that we're playing against our kick and our snares. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the sound we got there. It's starting to turn into, it's turning out a little better than I expected. So I hope you're enjoying this. And like I said, I've got a surprise for you in 2 weeks. Little hint, you might be able to practice some of this on your own. Just saying. So stick around. Thanks for being a VIP member. If you have questions on this, please ask away. I'd love to answer these and be more specific. And any question you have, other members who come along later and are watching this video will read through those questions in the comments below. And any answers that I give to you might be helpful to them too. So definitely ask your questions, and let's make sure we help everybody as best we can. All right, for the outro music, we listen to the drums that we have so far. Thanks, folks. See ya.